Thank you, everybody. I'm really looking forward to hearing from this fantastic panel today. It's a time of unprecedented change, I think, in Australia with the new wave of renewables coming, and that's no change for the mining industry. We've got rising energy prices combined with better and cheaper technology, and I think the business case for renewable energy in mines has never been better. I'm really looking forward to hearing from the panel. These are the people at the coalface of the decisions, so certainly interested in what they have to say. So the first question for all of the panel members is, why does renewable energy integration make business sense today? What are the main drivers? Perhaps Richard, if you'd like to start us with that one.
No, I can't. Oh, down the technical issue.
Perhaps then if we start with Kirsten while you...
I may have the same technical issue.
You're right. I'm right now. Sorry about that. I missed the introduction because I was sitting down the back. But yeah, look, the main drivers in the industry at the moment, from an operator's point of view, representing Sandfire Resources, at the time we were offered an opportunity to build a solar farm as we did a few years back. And really, it was always the prime driver for an operator is about cost. And we were lucky with the support from the government and other players in doing that. Potentially, if we had to go and fund that ourselves, we probably may not have gone ahead with the solar farm at that point in time. Today, it's a different story. So we're talking a few years ago at that decision point. So, as always, cost is a main driver, capital operating cost. And then the other big one that we've seen over the years has been the importance of the issue around sustainability and the reputation that brings to the companies that go ahead and put these types of facilities in place, particularly as first drivers in the industry. And the benefit out of that has been quite huge, and there's been a huge payback if you want to put that in some form of monetary terms. So they're probably my main ones. Cost, sustainability and reputation be the key drivers for us in terms of going ahead with such a facility. I don't know about other people's views here.
Yeah. Bethwyn, from your perspective?
No, as are all exactly the same drivers that we're seeing, and the same types of issues are being raised around corporate social responsibility and sustainability of mining in the long term. Just a little bit of a variation on this theme that Richard mentioned is reducing our exposure to fuel volatility. So as global markets tend to move on diesel and gas prices, what can we do to stabilise our oil cost or our energy costs, which leads to other expansions and different business opportunities.
Okay, and anything different for BHP?
Surprisingly, no. Yeah, so we measure energy decisions at BHP much as you do, around affordability, reliability, and sustainability, and balancing that, that oft spoken about trilemma is really the drivers for the work that we're doing. And, I echo everything that you guys have said. The cost we'll talk about, I'm sure, extensively, but renewables are there now, which is brilliant. The reliability piece is enormous in terms of, you must have reliable supply. And I think what's interesting there is the technology advances that have really have come just so far, so fast, and are making renewables a much more reliable part of the energy mix, even than a couple of years ago. I have a colleague here from our Chilean operations who's speaking later today, and I don't want to steal his thunder, but he's going to be talking about the role that gas is playing in firming renewables in the Chilean grid. And it's an amazing story, and it's definitely one that maybe he saw it, I didn't see it a couple of years ago, and it's really evolving quickly. So I think things are changing really rapidly. And sustainability, absolutely. I think what's different there now, even to a couple of years ago, is the importance that organizations are putting on that in their energy decisions. I can certainly speak from a BHP perspective. We did a big piece of work in Australia last year where we weighted those three things equally for the first time. So affordability, reliability, and sustainability were equal partners in decision making, and that's a big step forward.
I find that really interesting. So affordability, reliability, and sustainability with equal weighting. Perhaps, Gerard, on that particular point, do you have any comments for us?
Yeah, I think that I'd agree with all the other panel members on the drivers and increasingly, I suppose, the outlook that we're looking for, so the world ahead and where we see directionally pricing for fossil fuels heading. So how do we take action and start thinking about that now? So from a Pilbara perspective on ore operations, we've got a lot of installed capacity, so there's a challenge there about what we do when you have already installed and you're not starting an operation, you're in a different decision point. But then from a global perspective, from the group, there's a fundamental shift happening within Rio. There's a full rebalancing of the portfolio. So 69% of Rio Tinto's global power comes from renewables, mostly in our aluminium business, and there are a few other operations that have renewables, but it is a significant shift.
Yeah, 69% is quite impressive. And perhaps we'll start with you on the second question as well, which is around the types of renewable energy solutions that are advancing. Obviously, we see a lot of solar and battery in Australia, but there's also, new and upcoming technology and questions about how wind could work in mines as well. So what's your view on that, and what do you think makes certain projects work?
It depends very much on local context. So we've got, for example, of our Diavik operations in Canada, that's wind supported by diesel, but so that wind power will supply up to 50% of the operation's daily demand. In Weipa, we've had solar with diesel backup, and that supplies 20% of Weipa town site's power capacity. Both of those examples are diesel displacement, right? So remote location, high cost diesel in terms of actually cost of diesel and the cost of transporting diesel. So the business case is quite different there to the challenges again that we've got in other operations, so the Pilbara, where the balances are a bit closer, but they're the first two.
Okay, well, that's really interesting. So seeing a lot of diesel replacement as effectively like the first wave. What are your views on potentially what's next and what's happening?
Yeah, I mean, for BHP, our story is not a diesel displacement story because BHP, for those of you who aren't aware, is largely a grid-connected mining company. So the only place in the world where we have any meaningful self-generation is in Western Australia, and that's relatively efficient gas. So the business case for us is not always as obvious on a fuel displacement basis, but even so, the business cases are starting to look pretty strong for a grid-connected mining company, which is really exciting. The advancements in renewables, obviously, wind and solar are clearly the winners from a price competitiveness standpoint, but I think what's really interesting to look at now is the kind of growing hybridization projects that are coming through now, and the ones that are already in progress and the ones that are being talked about as the next frontier of what we kind of need to make it work and how renewables need to work in a mining context, and whether that's PV hybridized with gas, with some storage, or with diesel, or whatever the combination is. I think that those projects are going to be fascinating for us to learn from. And the control systems and the integration and making those work, as Sandfire has sort of led the way on, is going to be incredibly important. So it's not just a standalone answer anymore. It's not just PV is the answer. So I think that's the next frontier. And I couldn't agree with you more about the sort of the devil's in the details on these projects. And I know that's probably not telling this room anything you don't know from lived experience, but I think it's quite easy to make broad, sweeping statements about the cost competitiveness and inevitability of renewables, and I can say that because I'm the one usually making those statements. And but when you get into these projects and look at them from our perspective, the economics are often sort of a line call in many cases between a new solution and a BAU solution. And so what you asked about, you asked Joe what makes them work or not work, and it's often in the detail. Like it's, if you need gas, then what, do you have gas, and in what form, and the O&M requirements, and some of the specific things that are very, very local and site specific are what can tip it from being kind of a no-brainer on paper to being actually kind of hard to sell into our environment. So again, as an industry, that's our frontier, is to learn and try to make sure that we can all share on how to reduce those obstacles and make these projects a lot easier to implement and buy.
Mm-hmm. And Kirsten, you spoke a lot about hybridisation and the devil being in the detail, and perhaps Bethwyn, you could respond on that particular point.
From a Fortescue perspective, we would 100% agree that these projects look good. When you've got large-scale solar and wind projects, they look good, the economics look nice. But to Jared's point, Fortescue's in a similar position where we have predominantly islanded generation. We're not on a grid. We have large-scale gas generation in our main Solomon hub, and we've got diesel generation at the moment on our hub, our Chichester hub, which is closer to the east. But in terms of what we're looking at in terms of different renewable options, we've looked at solar and wind. We've got very good wind resources and solar resources in the Pilbara. But what we are starting to do a little bit more is look a little bit more outside the box in terms of hydrogen, pump storage, vanadium flow batteries, tidal power. So these are things that we wouldn't usually see in a mining operation, but we've got fantastic resources in WA, and to Kirsten and Jared's point, it is really site-specific in terms of what works. But that integration and the control system work, I think, is the key for those types of islanded projects.
And perhaps, Richard, you've got first-hand experience with Sandfire in the project. Did you have any comments on integration, devil in the detail?
Yes, most definitely. I don't think one size fits all, as we've basically touched on already in the brief discussion. Like, whilst we talk about Sandfire up in the Pilbara there, we are developing a mine over at Montana, the Black Butte mine. That's a totally different setup. That will be on mains grid, so the opportunity to put in a renewable solution there is probably minimal at this stage in the study program. And again, it's all driven by pure costs and the economics of doing that. But having said that, just reflecting on the history of what we've done at Sandfire in terms of development of renewable solutions, and then talking to others in the industry, there's a lot to still evolve. Now, we talk about power control systems. For me, that is the absolute heart of the whole thing works. So you've got a solar farm or a wind farm or both, you've got diesel or gas, then you've got a battery facility, and you've got to be able to manage that power articulation and make sure you've got the reliability to your customer, be that the underground operations and the mill itself, the processing, without any peaks or troughs in the power delivery. And without that, it just gets too damn hard. And we had a number of those kind of issues as we brought that solar farm online. The last 6-8 months has been absolutely smooth sailing in that sense. So we've got rid of all those little troubling issues, but still looking forward, there's plenty of room for improvement and optimisation on the current system up there. Some of it is commercial, but a lot of it is technological as well. So from a budding technologist as much as a mining engineer, I'm really keen to get ourselves into a mine where we can develop that further and do things a lot smarter and a lot cheaper, and put ourselves out there on the cutting edge of being competitive. Energy being one of our higher costs in these types of operations.
Certainly interested in seeing what Sandfire does next, being a thought leader in this area. We'll move on to our next question, and perhaps Bethwyn, this is one for you. So what key criteria go into assessing the business case for renewables and storage investments?
So I think we've all touched on that in some of the earlier questions, but the absolute key for a miner, especially for Fortescue, which is off-grid, is security of supply. So we just cannot have situations where we have any downtime. We're a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week operation. and any type of interruption costs real money. And there's always a delay then with getting back online where you have an interruption. So that's the primary factor. The secondary factor in reality is cost. So how cost competitive are renewable integrations to putting in known generation, I would call it, so a gas turbine or a diesel type generation where we know that it is generally secure, and how does that work with the points that Richard just made about integrating and the risk profile that comes with integrating renewables, which is definitely improving. Something that I think Bill mentioned in his speech, which is really at the forefront for Fortescue as well, is this technological change. Where we're struggling a little bit is where do you install, or at what point in the cost curve do you install your solar, your wind, your lithium ion, your vanadium, and where's the best point to dip your toe in the water? We've seen with solar and wind significant cost reductions, so we're a lot more comfortable around those technologies. But when we start to look at batteries and we start to look at hydrogen and we start to look at tidal, we think, well, how much further down the cost curve do those technologies have to come, and when's the right time for us to invest in those? Another point on that is the capital, to the capital cost point, is around competing capital within the business. So while we can get good paybacks on these solar returns and wind and diesel cost displacements, there are other capital challenges within the business, and where we can get bigger paybacks, that's generally where we put the money. And partnership for us is a really key focus. So because of these control system technology challenges, I think, and it's so technical, you have to be with the right partner. So you need to be able to work consistently through issues that are going to arise, because issues will arise. When we're off grid, we need the partnership to work, and that's really a focus for us as well.
Okay, and I saw a bit of nodding from the panel when you were speaking about cost curve. Did anyone else have a comment on that?
Yes, I agree with the cost curve point. I also particularly, I think what resonates really well is the security of supply. Security of supply, supply security. I think we're all in that same bucket there, where we've got massive operations that are highly reliant on stable supply of energy, and any interruption is extraordinarily expensive. So entering that space, you've got to be confident and have a good business case if you're going to get a hearing. I think we are sort of seeing within Rio Tinto now that we're sort of focusing on, there's sort of three areas we focus on. One is energy measurement now. There's a strong focus on energy measurement. So we meter energy well, right? Power and diesel. But tracking usage down to activity operator level is an extraordinary challenge. So there's a focus there, because before you start driving some energy efficiency and improvement projects, you've got to really make sure that those investments get a return. Because I do agree, we are starting to balance some of the measures. We're still driving MPV positive projects, but those projects that have a positive rate of return, the ones that the scarce resources get allocated to will be the ones with the biggest carbon footprint, so the biggest return. But you've got to measure them, right? So you've sort of measurement, energy efficiency, and then in the backbone of that, supporting is developing a longer term renewable pathway, and we're sort of working in those three areas now. I think we've got a couple of managers here today that are working on the long term, energy measurement stuff in the business, and also the longer term energy renewables pathway.
Okay, and how do the other companies deal with the energy measurement and the unknown? The issue, perhaps, is that something you want to comment on?
Yeah, Jared, that's exactly the same problem that we're having. So we meter pretty well, but from an operational perspective, actually knowing what we use and how we're using it, and particularly I think for renewables, when we're going to use it, is a challenge. So putting those types of policies and procedures within the business, and I I think that the focus for us has been getting operators to own their energy usage, and that has really started to transform how we track it. But the same challenges that we've got, I think, really flow into how renewable projects are integrated within the business.
Okay, so our next question for the panel is what barriers and internal hurdles are renewable projects continuing to encounter? So we've discussed this at a quite a general level, but would anyone on the panel like to comment on that in a bit more detail, perhaps?
Okay, well, if we sort of think of the energy mix for our operations, so perhaps the scale will give everyone a bit of a sense of what the challenge we have in managing the business. So, Pilbara operations for Rio Tinto at the moment, we're at 330 to 340 million tonne per annum, growing to 360 million tonne per annum by 2019. We've got our installed power capacity for power stations, one connected grid through all our operations, four ports, 1,700 kilometres of railway line, more than 200 locomotives and haul trucks. So I think we're in excess of 300 haul trucks, 95 autonomous. So you've got a massive network. From the electrical power side, barriers there are number one priority, security of supply security. Supply security, it's all gas, so it's efficient power generation. A lot of it locked in, predominantly longer term contracts. So breaking into that, so you've got some commercial considerations in that space. But then on the other side is those locomotives, trucks, drills, everything consume a lot of diesel. So we've got an extensive diesel distribution and storage network to support the operations. But that's a space I think that probably has the greatest, we've seen, greatest opportunity. We're doing a lot of work in that space, which is like the diesel displacement. It's also important when you think about the CO2 impact. Diesel's about 1.3 times a CO2 impact for the same amount of work as gas. So it's a good place to focus. And for our business, it makes sense in terms of what we were talking before about the projected costs for diesel going forward. Likewise, in the diesel space, we can, I suppose that's the technology in terms of opportunities coming in there. So that's it's probably the challenge we're really thinking about at the moment is in the diesel space. For us, the spend on energy, about 2/3 of our spend is in the diesel space as well.
Okay, so 2/3 of the spend in diesel, that definitely makes good business case for some diesel displacement. Anyone else from the panel got a comment on the barriers or internal hurdles?
I certainly can. I think one of our experiences has been the fact that we have two energy suppliers on site, and commercially that's problematic, considering that the diesel genset supplier was set up first, and of course the terms and conditions around that contract. There is ultimately some conflict going forward with a new one with the renewables on the solar. So, looking forward in the industry, particularly more in the mids and the junior sector, my discussions, everyone's desperately looking for a single source provider. So that whole thing is evolving at this stage, but that's potentially a hurdle. You don't want to be having conflict with, on a commercial basis, for what you want is a stable supply of energy, as we said, and at a reasonable price without having terms and conditions that are going against you, which kind of negates the fact of why are we trying to do what we're trying to do from an economic basis. So that's one of them, and I see that evolving as opportunity comes up, and we'll see more suppliers being able to deliver a hybrid solution to a mining group or any other group out there. And I'm thinking more obviously from a microgrid point of view. Other barriers, the technology ones. For us, the batteries are limited. The batteries facility is closely associated with our spinning reserve. So our big power consumers on the site there is the SAG mill and the ball mill, and effectively at this stage, which is a function of some of the commercial aspects of the contracts and also the function of the batteries capacity, we're a little limited in what we've got to do. So we actually have to run at this stage still a diesel genset just in case one of the other ones go down, which is not terribly efficient. But that's part of the learning experience, and we're working with both groups there to try and resolve that issue for us moving forward. So they're just some of the little issues that, for another start-up operation or a larger operation that was considering going to renewables would look at and resolve up front, now that I think we have solutions going forward. And technology in the batteries themselves, my other point around that is the ability for them to hold more charge. It's a limiting factor, and it always will be from where I look into the future for a considerable point of time. So I don't think we'll ever have a fully solar or fully wind facility for mining operations 24/7, not in the foreseeable future anyway, because of where I think the battery technology will be in the near and mid-term. But if I'm wrong, I'll be gladly have someone come and show me and demonstrate otherwise. Thank you.
You might have some people come and see you in the break. Right.
From a Fortescue perspective, we're saying have a similar challenge to what you've mentioned, Jared, and we've invested significant capital in power station assets, which means that putting additional capital in for solar and wind or renewable type projects, it doesn't make sense. We've got some opportunity on our Chichester hub, which at the moment is all diesel generation, but that has other challenges that we've just spoken about around technology. What do you put in? How does it work? I think for WA, though, one of the biggest challenges is a lack of infrastructure and the lack of grid. So where you have these off-site mining operations, which predominantly most of it is, the power generation with the lack of grid means you can't put in large-scale renewable projects, and there's a lot of learnings to be done, I think, in the state for that. And from a diesel perspective, the majority of our diesel is used in fleet. So while displacement of diesel in power station, on-site power station, does have a cost benefit, the big prize for us is fleet displacement, diesel displacement in fleet. So what does that look like in terms of alternative fuels? And we class things like hydrogen and those types of things in a renewable context.
No, that's definitely interesting, and I'm interested to see where things go with the hydrogen. All right, so our next question is, has the commercial value of renewables been clearly communicated and demonstrated? So Richard, I know you've got a project that's been commissioned and up and running, so perhaps you might want to lead that one.
My initial thought to that when I first came across that question a few weeks ago, I went, no. But, and I've answered it early on anyway, and I said, in the context of Sandfire back several years, if it wasn't for the funding from ARENA and the other parties, maybe we would not have gone through with it, simply for the upfront capital costs required. The other factor we haven't talked about is mine life. If you haven't got mine life, then the whole question around capital comes into play. But if you've got a long mine life, makes some of those decisions somewhat easier in that sense. So at that point where we were, we figured we had enough mine life just by the time we got it installed. So that was just a questionable decision. So the other point I was going to raise earlier, but I didn't, was there's a point there where we have this thing called, well, I call it the leap of faith. You've basically got everything lined up as much as you can. You know as much as you know, and you don't know what you don't know. And you make that decision and think, well, let's do this. If it doesn't go according to plan, well, we'll have backup plans. We'll always go back, in this case, to the diesel and carry on. But so for us, I would say back then, and now it's a tentative yes, but today I would suggest it's a yes. They're getting far more competitive in cost, and I think they'll do so more so in the future because I can see the technology changing, getting better quality materials in there that will last longer and be more efficient. And the other aspect I'm looking at is the ability to be mobile. So when I look at the solar farm and all the facilities around it, it isn't too mobile. Maybe some components are consumables, the panels themselves potentially. So, but certainly the battery facility isn't mobile the way we've constructed it, but maybe it should be like our diesel genset farm is. And just that kind of thinking needs to be brought into the industry for the resource groups, how to try and get our costs down. But all up, yeah, renewables, strong supporter. So whilst I open this question up with a no, I will close it with a yes, just to confuse everyone.
No, that's great. And the rest of the panel, yes, no, maybe, not yet?
I think we're quietly optimistic. So we have no renewable integration at the moment in any of our mine sites. We're grid connected up in Port Hedland, but at Solomon and our Chichester hub, we're on gas and diesel. So we have to make the leap of faith, as Richard says, which hopefully we can make in the near future, but quietly optimistic, I think.
Yeah, same. I would say ish. So, I mean, I'm a huge fan. We're similar. We don't have, our only renewables in operations is in Chile at the moment, in a meaningful scale. So, yeah, we're getting there. And I think the sophistication of the conversation is just moving at light speed, which is incredibly encouraging. So we're getting there.
Yeah, well, the only thing I'd add is that the point that it is changing. We've still got the basic financial hurdles, right? You know, it's got to have positive NPV case, rate of return, capital intensity. So that's clear. But the technology in the space is changing so rapidly, and these hybrid solutions mean that you've continually got to be reassessing an option. So it's always a part of our options. So people track down Kieran Birch here, so he's a study manager on renewables. So we actively, of all of our studies now, we're actively including renewables in there. So they've just got to get to that tipping point where they're competitive. So it's certainly very close.
Okay, so I'm always an optimist, so I read that as we're getting closer and closer to yes. So our next question, Kirsten, perhaps you take this one. It's how do renewables fit with the broader sustainability and energy goals across mining operations?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. So this is the space that my work is largely in, is connecting BHP's broader sustainability and environment goals with the reality of kind of operations and how we deliver those goals. So it's something I'm really passionate about. And renewables play an incredibly important role in that broader sustainability and energy conversation at many levels. You know, we've talked a lot about balancing that trilemma and the importance of reliability and security. Kind of zooming out to the goals, BHP has taken a sector-leading sort of position and stance on climate change and related for a long time. And we look at climate change risk and climate change opportunities through kind of 5 pillars. So adaptation, so how can our assets and operations adapt to the effect of climate change? Mitigation, which is the continued kind of push to obviously mitigate emissions, which is often in sort of an energy efficiency continuous improvement frame. Stakeholder engagement, which is policy and advocacy. So if you've read the Financial Review this week, our Australian president has been very outspoken around issues on the neg. We look at our portfolio of commodities through a climate change lens, and we're constantly evaluating the effects and sort of what that might mean to what we are mining and extracting. And then last is low emissions technology, which is my portfolio, which is around how we develop and deploy technology that has the potential to make material greenhouse gas emission reductions. And that is in part because BHP has committed to some very ambitious public targets in the space. We have a suite, as many of our peer companies do, a suite of health, safety, environment, and community targets. And in the environment space, we have greenhouse gas targets. And to give you a sense, our 5-year targets is, so by 2022, we've committed to not increase, to basically holding our emissions to a 2017 baseline, regardless of how we grow the business. So that's an absolute target, and that means we're going to have to find significant amounts of abatement in the business because, as Bill was talking about earlier, our ores are getting harder, our pits are getting deeper, the energy and water intensity of the operations is causing that emissions forecast to go up, not down. So, whilst there's an incredibly important role for that energy efficiency, we've got to also chase really big changes against those emissions reduction targets. And so renewables are important. For BHP, we're grid connected mostly. 50% of our operational emissions are from electricity. The vast majority of that is Scope 2. So clearly there's an opportunity there. But tagging on to what you were saying about diesel, more than a third of our group emissions are from diesel, and for us, that's in material movement. That's not in power generation, that's largely in trucks. So this presents some really interesting strategic challenges for us as a business and for the integration of renewables. And it kind of comes down, so if you believe, as I personally do, that in that effort to displace diesel out of material movement, a big part of that answer is electrification of mining. Then we have a couple key questions for BHP, and these are the strategic ones that we work on every day. One is, what's BHP's role in accelerating grids that are already decarbonizing very, very quickly? So do we have a role in that? Do we sit back and wait for the grids to do the work for us, the heavy lifting? Are they going to do enough against our targets and against the climate targets that we've committed to globally? Answer is probably not. So then how do we economically, rationally try to get those grids to decarbonize faster? And then as we're displacing our diesel and material movement with electricity, how do we ensure that those electrons are green electrons so that we're continually making progress against not only our 5-year target, but our long-term target, which is to be net zero in the second half of the century. So those aren't easy questions to answer, but renewables in all their forms and storage are going to play an incredibly important role in achieving that reduction of 3/4 of our group emissions. The other portion is from fugitives, which are far harder to abate from open cut coal mining. So sort of our policy and settings and our energy and our sustainability targets have a very, very direct impact in terms of how we think about our business and operationally and how renewables will play an increasingly important part.
I know that's certainly a fantastic goal, and keeping emissions at this baseline regardless of growth. I'm sure you've got lots of good ideas about how that will be managed. Any other comments from the panel on that one?
I think Kirsten's point on electrification and mining methods is a really important one. Where you get energy at a certain cost, you can change your whole mining methodology. So where I mentioned previously that the majority of our diesel usage is not in islanded power stations, it's in our diesel fleet. What can we do to change that? Where can we put in conveyors, for example, to stop that, minimise that material movement, take some diesel trucks off the road, electrically power conveyors? That's really important, and that type of processes and thinking is going on in our business as well. And that, to me, will change the way we use and integrate renewable energy.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your insights. I think it's time now to hand it over to the audience. So do we have any questions for our panel?
Thank you very much. It's John Pemberton from CoCam, a battery manufacturer. Just got a question for Kirsten. Kirsten, I was just picking up on your point about firming with gas, which is very sort of key to some of our thoughts. And I was wondering if BHP has sort of studied the short-run marginal cost of gas versus, say, renewables with long-term storage as such, and compared those costs. And of course, if we add batteries in the form of spinning reserve to gas, as we've done at Alinta, you really do get some real benefits in terms of reduced cost of gas.
Yeah, the answer is we have studied it in some depth, and there's many of my colleagues in the room today who can speak to that quite specifically in terms of the work we've done in that space. And there's some really interesting opportunities there. Again, as a grid-connected miner, the behind-the-meter opportunities for us, we think in the short term are relatively limited. The nearer-term opportunity is for us to pursue sort of procurement strategies through the grid and firming strategies through those procurement strategies to make sure that we're sourcing green electricity that's firmed up through a variety of financial mechanisms and structures. There are some interesting opportunities for us with gas, and that we're looking at more closely in our own operations, and particularly in Western Australia. So yeah, we have done a lot of work in that space and agree that there's a lot more to be done, a lot of opportunities there.
Using a battery as a spinning reserve tool, as you've just mentioned, I think is the primary focus for off-grid power stations. I think it works. That's where we're doing the numbers. And the Alinta Newman battery is a really good example of that, I think.
Okay, we had a question over here.
Hi, John O'Brien from Deloitte. This is a very fast-changing sort of technology environment. How do you globally do sort of discovery of technologies, what's coming through, and then how do you verify those? And I've seen a lot of technologies, and a lot of them are rubbish. So how do you pick out the good ones?
That's a good question. I think you've got to look at everything first, because the one you turn away may well be the one you want to back. So we do a lot from Rio Tinto. We do a lot in the technology space, right? And we are seeing real benefits of technology, not only in the cost space but in the safety space, and we'll see that in the environment space as well. So there's a three-pronged benefit to technology, and it's well worth the investment in it. And I think when we're talking about, I'll come back to the diesel displacement, because I suppose I have a vested interest in that, because that's my main space, is thinking about the Pilbara. And right immediately, so we have, as I mentioned, we're on our way to 360 million tonne per annum. So we've got our installed electrical capacity. So immediate opportunities, there's a challenge in introducing them. But beyond 2019 to 2020, 21, we're looking at that space there. Quite excited about the opportunity within the mobile fleet, right, and the rate of technology advancement. There's a combination of factors there. You think the large diesel trucks, a lot of them are diesel electric at any rate. There's quite a lot of providers now experimenting with even off-road battery diesel displacement. I think there's an interesting space there, whether it's either battery or it's LNG or compressed natural gas, those solutions in there. I think the combination of that plus autonomous haulage, and you're starting to get, there's a scale challenge that's got to be thought through or assessed. Traditionally with owner-operator, or with a manned haulage fleet, scale is a major driver because of the labour component of it. I think within an autonomous fleet, or autonomous integrated connected fleet, there's this, perhaps the scale and the challenge of electrifying very, very large dump trucks. Perhaps the solution is actually pulling the size of them back a bit. And so I think that the rate of advancement in technology in that space is going to be a lot faster than we think. So.
Very good. And a question, I think you had the microphone down the front. Oh, sorry, over here.
Hi, Alistair Dick from the Rocky Mountain Institute. Wonderful discussion. I have a question on hydrogen. I've heard so much more about hydrogen in Australia than I've heard anywhere else globally. What is the thinking around hydrogen? I've heard words like exportable hydrogen. Is hydrogen looking to offset natural gas? Where does hydrogen sit, and what are your thoughts?
So I think that's my fault. I think I mentioned hydrogen. So I think it kind of feeds into the gentleman's question that he just raised about technology and what don't you look at. And it's a really hard space, I think, with renewables and generally low emissions technology and clean energy. You can't afford to not look at anything. I think the only thing we haven't looked at to date is something that my engineers said defied the laws of physics, but we still got through the key to the keyfer. So there is a lot of resources internally about what do you look at, and hydrogen for us is something that I think we'd have to have our finger on the pulse on. It looks like a fuel that is getting a bit of momentum. I think it's a long way away. But is it a cleaner fuel? And can we displace things like diesel in trucks, which is primarily where we would be looking at it? There's a lot of technology work that has to be done with the truck deliverers around what that looks like. How do you integrate hydrogen into your fuel mix? But I think we look at all of those things. The benefit for something like that is it's a light fuel. You can get more ore on your truck. And it's low emissions, so it has a lot of benefits, but I think it's a long way away.
Hi, Alistair. Yeah, it's a great question, isn't it? So I laugh because I think in this space, as soon as I start hearing people have like knockdown, drag-out fights about a technology, that's when I start paying attention, because I think, okay, this is going to get interesting, and hydrogen's in that space. So I agree completely with what Bethan said. It's there's a lot about it that you can poke sticks at, but I also think there's a lot about it that could be compelling. And it really depends on, are we still going to have, 793s and 797s in a future world of mining? And if so, what could be a zero carbon fuel source? There aren't very many things that you can see that really powering a truck of that size, and hydrogen's one. So I think it's definitely worth keeping an eye on, and we've got sun, we've got water. So does Chile. Chile's doing a lot of work in this space. So yeah, it's interesting. I think it'll be good. I think we're keeping a close eye on it.
Lisa France, Energy Developments. Kirsten, you mentioned knockdown, drag it out fight, which brings me to politics. I'm curious about the impact that the bun fight that's going on between the feds and the different states regarding energy policy is having on your investment decisions in business. Well, for anyone on the panel.
Well, fortunately, I'm not in our government relations or policy team, so my answer will be short, lest they get cross with it. Look, the environment in Australia is very fractured. We all know that, and we have states pursuing state-level targets, which is, in our view, not super efficient in every case. The way we've addressed that, to answer your question, is in the work that we've done over the last year looking at electricity supply to Australian assets, we took a scenario-based modeling approach to prices. And so we played through several different scenarios of how we thought the electricity markets might go in Australia, and really played through some of those possibilities. And one of them is a highly kind of disaggregated, inefficient state-level targets, not a lot of federal policy. And so that's one of the ways that we look at the different possible price outcomes over the long term for the wholesale electricity market. And that's been quite useful for us. And we also have a NEG scenario, we have a Finkel scenario. We've looked at the different kind of ways these things can play through. And that's really helped guide our thinking, because we don't know exactly where it's going to go. What we do know is that it's certainly not decided yet, I suppose.
Hello. Hello, Matt Duxbury, Contract Power Australia. One of my observations from, I guess, looking at introduction to renewables in isolated systems over many years is that a lot of people don't actually understand the supply train of the alternative fuels that they're competing against. And in most instances, the renewables are a fuel saver. So with diesel, it's pretty straightforward. The diesel is a commodity, it's almost 100% saving, you've got it right there. Gas is a completely different story. So where gas is even being up at $13 a gigajoule, for instance, what portion of that is actually savable? So you have to look at the cost stream. You guys know what the gas contracts look like. A lot of people don't understand that. Can you just run us through that?
think there's a couple of points on that, and I think I mentioned earlier about the west and the east coast of Australia, and Kirsten's just mentioned about being very different energy hubs. The gas market in Western Australia is very different to the gas market on the east coast, and the numbers that we're seeing and that we've contracted are very different to east coast numbers. So the challenge for us in converting to a financial benefit the fuel savings that are being presented to us from for a number of providers is partly that misunderstanding, and it is hard. I think part of it is just the markets are different, and so therefore the assumptions are different, and things that might stack up on East Coast solutions don't stack up here. We've definitely seen that.
I would probably only add to that, which is come back to the security of supply. Right? With gas and supporting, you've got to have a long-term secure supply. So some of the longer-term contracts, we've always got to be looking in and securing that future. So whilst we're rolling those contracts forward, right, there's a barrier to renewables in that space until they. Right, you've got, this is where the supply security of supply tipping point comes. Until you've got a proven technology that actually competes, that you're comfortable with it, that has the same risk profile, that you're not going to take that step.
Okay, so we might have one more question before our break.
Yes. This is Michel Caro from Hatch. I'm global lead in hybrid power. Just have a question, probably corollary to Lisa's question. You talked about driving prices down of technologies, battery, solar, and so forth. Obviously, when we look at all the different trade-offs of the different options, price of fossil fuel is extremely important. And the supply and demand may impact significantly the price of fossil fuel. Diesel can go up and down. It has been in the last few years. Natural gas is more stable, but still in some jurisdiction, the natural gas price can just go up very significantly because it's imported in the form of LNG. But the price of fossil fuel is a driver in deciding whether or not a renewable power project is actually beneficial. So I would like to ask you, what's your thought on what's the long-term pricing we have to consider to evaluate those renewable power options, thinking that actually, even though you don't know the future, the renewable power is also an edge for fossil fuel power cost variations. So it has value in itself, even though it may be break even if you don't take that into consideration.
Perhaps we extend from that conversation before. One thing that Kirsten referred, look, we can't predict the future. We don't know. It's uncertain, particularly in this space. So we do have to be option ready. So like BHP and like I suppose F&G as well, you know, we've got long-term targets as a group. Rio Tinto, we've got a commitment to a 20% reduction in greenhouse gas 2008 to 2020, and we're well on the pathway to that, heavily driven by portfolio rebalancing, right? But we're also, right, in the longer term, committed to significantly decarbonising the business. So you've got to have options ready and studied. So that's, I suppose, our approach is those options may not be ready to patch into the business now, but we've got to continually test them. We've got to have a watching brief on technologies and how they arrive, and in these hybrid solutions, when they can compete, we can patch those in. And we've got to be thinking about how we set up a long-term decarbonisation or renewable pathway that currently the business doesn't have. So I don't know if that helps, but that's we've got to be ready for the uncertain future because we know it's going to be uncertain.
Okay, well, thank you. I mean, when we do most of our projects, that's what's happening is we ask the client, what's your forecast? They give us a number, and the actual number is higher than the forecast. So it's sort of, yeah, but you're killing the business case right there, but nobody knows the future. So, but it's certainly part of the mix in deciding how to go forward. Thank you.
Please join me in thanking our panelists.